This is the third video article in my series on how to write short stories, and in this article we're going to look at ideation and we're going to look at an idea that was suggested by Brandon Sanderson. And now what we're going to cover in a bit more detail, we are going to look at Brandon's idea of borrowing story structure. We're going to apply this to a story, and it's a Sherlock Holmes story. And we're also going to apply it to a Stephen King story, and you'll see how you do it. Before we dive into this much further, just a quick caveat that this concept that we're going to cover of borrowing story structure and adapting existing story structures is more for quite new fiction writers. So if you're new to writing, you've not written many short stories, and you're struggling to come up with ideas and visualize how those ideas get packaged into a complete story, then this technique might help you get through a few short stories and start to get a feel for how it all works. So, borrowing story structure. Brandon's got a video called 5 Tips for Your First Novel, and I will put a link in the description so you can click on that and you can go and watch the video. It's a shortish video. You can see it's 12 minutes 33 seconds, and the tip that we want is the very first tip. Now Brandon, this video he created for a National Novel Writing Week session. It was like a primer video just before whatever year the video was published, just before the National Novel Writing Month was about to start, and it was some tips for people, and this was his very first tip. And what he says with borrowing story structure is find a story you love and analyze the structure, identify the key elements that make the story work, rebuild and recast those key elements with your own characters and settings. For added bonus and added creativity, you can transpose genres. So if I remember correctly, Brandon suggested taking the structure of a Jane Austen story but making it a Western rather than a now when it's filmed, whatever, it's like a period drama. So we're going to apply that to a Sherlock Holmes story. That story I've chosen is called The Adventure of the Speckled Band. Here are the steps, the structural steps that form the skeleton of the story. The first one is the status quo. It's Sherlock and Watson chilling out at 222 Baker Street. The next step is a desperate supplicant arrives. And I won't go into all the story details in case you've not read the story, but I'll just give you the overview of the structure steps. And they're sketched out in quite broad strokes, and you'll see why in a second. The next story step is that Sherlock and Watson go from 222 Baker Street and they cross into the story world where they're going to find clues and do what they need to do. They're going to confront the hidden threat, and then finally the truth is going to be revealed and justice is going to be restored. So you'll see that there are no significant descriptions of the actual plot in many ways in terms of, so in this structural skeleton, so the hidden threat or the story world or what truth is revealed are reduced to very archetypal statements, so that you can then take those ideas and apply them to a different genre. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to take those steps and just sketch out 5 short sentences for each of those steps that will give you the outline of kind of like a horror story. Now, the status quo I've chosen is a psychic detective in his office, and this is a nod to Clive Barker. In his Books of Blood, there's a story about a psychic detective called Harry D'Amour, and I always thought Barker could have made a whole series of those stories because he was a really, really interesting character. If you can find that story, go read that, because that's also a great story. But for our purposes, status quo, we've got a detective who's something to do with psychic events. A desperate supplicant arrives. A woman's child has been kidnapped, and she thinks the child is going to be used in a ritual sacrifice, and the only person she knows who may be able to help, and she's pointed in this direction by perhaps a policewoman or someone, don't know the details, we're just sketching out the big brushstrokes of the story. She's come to our psychic detective to try and get help. Crossing into the story world, the detective goes to a desecrated church, which is where we think the ritual sacrifice, certainly where the detective thinks the ritual sacrifice is going to take place. Confronting the hidden threat, the detective finds out that he is actually the target, and the woman has been blackmailed by having her child kidnapped into being a decoy and to get him to come to this church by, as I say, I'm just kind of vamping, and I've got no idea who wants the detective and what they want to do, other than they want to kill him or put him out of action or whatever. I'm just using this as for illustrative purposes. And then the final archetypal step from the Speckled Band story was truth revealed, justice restored. So in this conclusion to the story, the detective, the woman, a child escape, and the bad guys are defeated, whoever they are and whatever they were planning to do to our psychic detective is obviously not done. Now, obviously, to turn that into a story, there's quite a lot of beats missing, but in terms of creating an overview of a story, you've got a clear idea of who the main characters are, the kind of arc of the story, and what happens, and you could use that and take it and turn it into a story. And that took me, it actually took me longer to write it out on the slides that I'm narrating from, or using as a prompt, than it did to actually think about it. It didn't take a lot of thinking at all, and you hopefully can see that that would create, or that structure would support a decent short story if all the elements that go with having a decent short story are added to it in terms of both the writing and the beats filling out the steps. So let's do another one. This time we're going to take a Stephen King story called The Ledge. That's in his first short story collection, which is called Night Shift. And there are, I think there's as many as 10 really good short stories. And some have, in my opinion, and different King fans will have different opinions, but in my opinions, some of his best short stories are in this collection. So the archetypal steps, or the archetypal structure that underpins the story in The Ledge, is a transgressor faces judgment. Said transgressor is then given an impossible choice, and although it's an impossible choice, there really is not much option, so he takes the challenge that's set for him. He faces great dangers but overcomes them, but his triumph is Pyrrhic, and there is an unexpected reversal at the end of the story. The Ledge is one of my favourite stories from Night Shift. That plus Quitters Inc. and Toy Soldiers are probably my three. It's worth getting that book just to read those three. But this is the kind of the underlying structural tent poles, if you like, of the story The Ledge. So we can take that and we can repurpose it, and I've chosen a crime thriller, and it's not totally dissimilar to what Steve wrote with The Ledge, but it's something slightly different. And obviously, when you do this exercise, if you're a science fiction writer or a fantasy writer or a detective story writer or a mystery writer or even a romance writer, anything like that, obviously you adapt these structural tempoles for your genre and the kind of stories you want to tell. You don't want to One thing you don't want to do is kind of lift the structure of the story and make it the same but slightly different. You can use these structural tent poles and create a story that will work, that will be original to you, will be authentic to you. No one will ever guess where the original Genesis was. Remember, this is more for beginners and trying to get beginners and people new to story writing to start coming up with ideas, sketching out these plot points, adapting them for their own purposes and their own genres and their own style of writing, and actually coming up with finished stories. That's the ultimate goal of this exercise. So, transgressor faces judgment. I've chosen a cat burglar who's unwittingly stole something from a mob boss. She's given an impossible choice, and the mob boss tells her she has to steal something from an even bigger mob boss, or she'll be killed. She takes the challenge. There's not really much thought about that, and the mob boss says you won't be able to run off because someone will be tailing you, and if you try and run off, you'll be intercepted and killed. She faces great dangers but overcomes them, and this stage is not really sketched out in any other detail than it. The theft is dangerous from the mob boss's house, wherever that is, or whatever she's been sent to steal. There's multiple booby traps and guards and other perils to avoid, but she gets through it, and she gets the item that she's been asked to steal, which is a MacGuffin. It's not really of any interest to the story, although, and I'll come to this in the next step, her triumph is Pyrrhic and there is a reversal. So she steals what she was asked to steal, but the first mob boss, the people who he had to follow her, has taken pictures and stuff, and if she doesn't do jobs for him, he'll give those pictures and the evidence to the second mob boss. Now, one thing that possibly you could do is she thinks she's just stealing, if you go back to the previous step, faces great dangers but overcomes them, and she gets the item. As the story is currently played out or laid out, the item that she steals from the second mob boss is not of any relevance to the story. But perhaps you could make a more nuanced story by somehow linking the thing that she stole that starts the story from the first mob boss and the thing that the first mob boss has asked her to steal from the second mob boss, and you could perhaps have some kind of nuanced connection that gets her out of her predicament at the end of the story, where she basically is going to be in hock to the first mob boss. Otherwise, he's going to tell the second mob boss that she was responsible for stealing his prized possession. Anyway, that was a thought that literally occurred to me as I was going through the slides. So not only will you get an original story this story, whatever shape or form it takes, would sound and feel nothing like Steve's The Ledge. But there is options to make the stories a little deeper and a little more nuanced, and so they'll have more of a kick to them. But that's what I wanted to show you in this video, was you take the story structure, you adapt it for your own stories, and you use that as a high-level overview of a story. You've still got the job of filling in the beats, peopling the story with characters, description, dialogue, all that kind of stuff. But if one of your problems is you don't know what to write about, you don't know what kind of stories to create, doing this and marrying it with the genres you want to write in will give you a kickstart. So let's just summarize briefly what we've gone through. So Brandon Sanderson, borrowing story structure and adapting it, comes from a video that is linked in the description below where you're watching this, if you're watching on YouTube, that is. I then gave you a practical application with a Sherlock Holmes story, The Case of the Speckled Band, and we came up with a different story Still a kind of detective story, but like a psychic detective story, with a hat-tipped Clive Barker and his character Harry D'Amour. And then we applied it again to a Stephen King story, The Ledge, and came up with a kind of crime, mob bossy, kind of thrillery kind of story that's based on the Stephen King story, but is very, very different from the Stephen King story. So, and the examples that I gave with the adaptations were literally done in each was done in like 2 minutes. So I didn't spend a great deal of time on them. So you could spend a little bit more time and go into a bit more depth. But as I said, this technique is perfect for people who are reasonably new to writing and looking for ways to come up with ideas that will lead to finished stories, so they can start getting stories under their belt and start getting those complete repetition of ideation, first draft, putting it away, editing, revision, cutting, finished draft, sending it somewhere or publishing it somewhere. So you can get that complete revolution done with a number of stories reasonably quickly, rather than sitting there pretending you've got writer's block because you don't know what to write about. In the next video, we're going to look at something from Damon Knight. And Damon Knight wrote a book called Creating Short Fiction, which I think is the best book on writing short stories that I've read. There are some other ones. Nothing is as good as Damon's book. What we're specifically going to look at is, in Damon's book, he comes up with a classification for a number of different types of short story. And this is, so obviously if you're thinking about writing short stories, genre is one thing. I'm going to write a crime story, I'm going to write a fantasy story, or I'm going to write a science fiction story, whatever it is. But within all of those genres, there are different types of short stories, and that's what we're going to look at in the next video article. Until then, if you need to drop me an email or ask a question, I'm at paul@deliberate-practice.com, and I'll be with you in episode 4 or the 4th in this series on how to write short stories, and we'll be talking about Damon Knight's classification of different short story types.